When you picture the Wild West, you probably imagine heroic cowboys, legendary gunslingers, and stoic sheriffs facing down outlaws at high noon. That's the Hollywood version. The reality for most people was far less glamorous, infinitely smellier, and honestly, just plain dumb. To make a living on the frontier, you had to be willing to do things that would make a modern person quit on the spot. So today, we're looking at 33 of the absolute dumbest, most absurd, and downright disgusting jobs that people actually had in the Wild West. 1. Let's kick things off with a masterpiece of deceptive marketing, the Gong Farmer. It sounds fancy, doesn't it? Like you cultivate artisanal gongs for Buddhist monasteries. The reality was a lot less zen. Gong was slang for dung, and your farm was the town's collection of foul, stinking outhouses. Your job was to creep out at night, armed with a shovel and a bucket, and scoop out the unholy contents of every privy. You were the town's poop wizard, making the magic happen so people didn't have to wade through their own filth. The pay was probably decent because no one else wanted the job, but your social life was non-existent. It's hard to make friends when your signature cologne is "Oh to everyone's regrets." 2. If managing an entire town's waste felt like too much responsibility, you could specialize in the micro-disgusting world of the Spatoon Cleaner. Every saloon had these brass pots of damnation, which served as the official receptacle for a cowboy's worst impulses. It was a vile cocktail of chewing tobacco spit, cigar butts, cheap whiskey, and probably a few lost teeth. At the end of the night, some poor soul had to grab these sloshing, heavy vessels of liquid misery, try not to vomit from the smell, and wash them out. You'd hear the cheerful piano and laughter from the bar, all while you were elbow-deep in a substance that science has yet to properly categorize. It was the absolute worst part of the party, and it was your whole job. 3. Some jobs were gross, but others were just a fundamentally bad business plan for your own body. Case in point, the Leech Collector. Back then, medicine often meant bleeding people with leeches for basically any ailment. But you can't just buy leeches on Amazon. No, doctors hired a professional human bait. Your job was to wade into the most stagnant, disgusting swamp water you could find and just stand there like a living, breathing buffet. The leeches would latch onto your legs, drink their fill of your blood, and only then were they ready for market. You were literally selling your own blood, one slimy parasite at a time, all while courting cholera and 1,000 other waterborne diseases for a cure that was pure medieval nonsense. 4. On the frontier, the concept of a daily shower was a wild fantasy. So, the town bathhouse was a big deal, and running it was the town bath attendant. This wasn't a spa manager gig with scented oils and fluffy towels. This was aquatic horror. You were the guardian of one tub and its very questionable water, which was often recycled for multiple customers to save time and money. Imagine the sign-up sheet. Cleanest guy goes first, dusty prospector second, and the guy who just wrestled a pig goes last. Your job was to announce when the human soup had reached maximum capacity, haul out the old gray water, and haul in the new. You were a glorified lifeguard for a tub of filth. 5. You think your laundry day is bad? Meet the frontier laundress, whose job was a full-blown declaration of war on filth. It was a brutal, thankless task. First, you'd haul water from a creek. Then, you'd boil it over a fire while trying not to pass out from the heat. Then, you'd scrub clothes stained with mud, blood, and things we can't mention on YouTube, using lye soap so harsh it could probably dissolve a horseshoe. Your hands were permanently raw, your back was always aching, and you were paid pennies to boil someone else's lice-infested long johns. It was less of a job, and more of a punishment for the crime of needing to eat. And you thought sorting whites and colors was a hassle. 6. Before light bulbs, you had candles. And before candles, you had a very smelly person called a Tallow Chandler. Their job was to take rendered animal fat, the leftover, often rancid gunk from butchers, and boil it into candles and soap. The process created a smell so monumentally awful, it could knock a buzzard off a meat wagon. It was a thick, greasy, gag-inducing stench that clung to you, your clothes, and your very soul. You were providing a vital service, but you were also the reason people invented property lines. Everyone wanted your candles. Absolutely no one wanted you as a neighbor. Your only friends were the flies, and even they looked like they were holding their breath. 7. If you craved authority and had a death wish, you could apply to be the town marshal in a place with a name like Tombstone or Dead Man's Gulch. Spoiler alert, the names weren't ironic. You got a tin star, a tiny salary, and the daily thrill of being the only thing standing between a peaceful afternoon and a full-scale riot started by drunk cowboys. It was a job with a shockingly high turnover rate, mostly because the previous marshal had just been used for target practice. Taking this job meant you were either the bravest person on the planet, or you were just really bad at math. Your life insurance premium was basically your entire salary. It wasn't a career path, it was a career cliff. 8. For a slightly safer but infinitely more stressful job, you could be a billiard scorekeeper. In the fancier saloons, a billiard table was the height of entertainment. The scorekeeper was the guy who sat on a high chair, looking all official while he tracked the points on a slate. The problem? The players were the same guys who would start a fistfight over a warm beer. This made you a human calculator in what was effectively a combat zone. You were ignored until a dispute broke out, at which point you became the star witness, prime target, and first person to dodge a flying billiard ball. Your job was 10% addition and 90% ducking. All for the glory of telling two angry armed men that one of them just lost a 50-cent bet. 9. While some people were dealing with filth outdoors, others were fighting it indoors. Meet the rat catcher. In towns made of wood and filled with food scraps, rat infestations weren't just a nuisance, they were a biblical-level plague. And there were no clever traps or high-tech poisons. The job of a rat catcher was simply to walk into a basement or storeroom, armed with a stick, maybe a terrier dog if they were lucky, and just go to war. It was you versus a swarm of disease-ridden, screeching vermin in a confined space. You had to be fast, ruthless, and completely devoid of fear. Or maybe just so desperate for a few coins that you were willing to risk getting bitten by an animal carrying the Black Death. This wasn't pest control, it was hand-to-hand combat with the world's most disgusting army. 10. If you wanted a job that sounded cool but was actually a ticket to an early grave, look no further than the shotgun messenger. This person rode shotgun on a stagecoach, which sounds like the best seat in the house. In reality, your job description was simple. Be the first person to get shot. You were a human scarecrow with a firearm. When bandits attacked, they weren't aiming for the horses. They were aiming for the guy with the big gun. You were paid a few extra dollars to be the official bullet sponge, absorbing the initial volley of lead so the driver might have a chance to escape. You were literally sitting on a moving target in the middle of nowhere, making you the most visible and least protected person for miles. The job title should have been Professional Outlaw Distraction. 11. The Weather Prophet. In an age before meteorology, predicting the weather was a matter of life and death for farmers and travelers. And who did they turn to? The weather prophet, a man whose entire profession was basically educated guessing dressed up as mystical science. This guy would roll into town and declare with absolute authority that rain was coming because he saw which way an ant was crawling, or that a dry spell was imminent because of a specific ache in his left knee. He was a master of vague pronouncements and serious expressions. The genius of this job was that if you were right, you were hailed as a visionary. If you were wrong, and a flash flood wiped out the town's crops, you were already 3 counties away, consulting with the squirrels about the next forecast. It was a career built on pure, unadulterated confidence and the ability to run really fast. 12. The Turkey Drover. You think herding cattle is tough? Imagine trying to herd hundreds, sometimes thousands, of the dumbest, most panic-prone birds on the planet across hundreds of miles of open country. That was the job of a turkey drover. Unlike cattle, turkeys have zero herd instinct. They scatter at the slightest noise, get eaten by predators constantly, and have a collective IQ of a dusty rock. The drover's job was a slow, agonizingly frustrating death march, trying to guide this feathered chaos towards a market town. You'd lose dozens of birds a day to coyotes, exhaustion, or them simply wandering off in a state of existential confusion. It was less like being a cowboy, and more like being a frantic, failing babysitter for an army of suicidal, feathered idiots. The pay could be decent if enough of them survived, but the mental toll was probably catastrophic. 13. Imagine being so good at the piano that your boss puts you in a cage to protect you from the customers. Welcome to the life of the Caged Saloon pianist. The honky-tonk piano was the heart and soul of any good saloon, but the saloon itself was a chaotic mess of brawls, flying bottles, and the occasional stray bullet. The solution? Build a cage of iron bars or chicken wire around the piano and the pianist. Your job was to keep playing cheerful, upbeat music while a full-scale riot erupted just inches from your face. You were both the entertainment and a zoo exhibit, a trapped musician providing the soundtrack to chaos. It was the only job where your performance review depended on both your musical talent and your ability to not flinch when a chair shattered against the bars of your cage. 14. Feeling unwell? Need a haircut? Why not get both done at the same place? The Barber Surgeon was the frontier's terrifying one-stop shop for personal grooming and medical malpractice. This was the guy who would give you a shave with a straight razor, and then use that same unsterilized razor to lance a boil, pull a tooth, or even amputate a finger. There was no concept of germs, just a can-do attitude and a terrifying confidence in his own limited abilities. The barber chair was also the operating table. You'd go in for a trim and he might say, "You know, your color's a bit off. I think you need a good bloodletting." It was a job that combined the precision of a barber with the medical knowledge of a drunk blacksmith. 15. Mining was one of the most dangerous jobs in the West, but some miners had an even weirder, more stressful job: the mine canary keeper. Deep underground, pockets of deadly, odorless gases like carbon monoxide could kill you before you even knew they were there. The solution was a low-tech feathered gas detector, a canary. The keeper's job was to care for these birds and bring them down into the mines. As long as the canary was chirping, the air was safe. The moment it got woozy, fainted, or just dropped dead, it was your signal to run for your life. Your entire existence was tied to the health of this tiny bird. It was a job that required you to become emotionally attached to your own expendable warning system. It's the only job where a moment of silence was the scariest sound in the world. 16. The railroad was the lifeblood of the West, but building it was a special kind of hell. The men who did the manual labor were called Gandhi dancers, a name that sounds far too cheerful for the reality. This job was pure, back-breaking toil. Teams of men would stand under the scorching sun or in freezing cold, using heavy hand tools to align and spike down massive steel rails. It was repetitive, grueling work that required perfect synchronization. One misplaced swing of a spike maul could shatter a man's leg or worse. The pay was awful, the conditions were miserable, and you were often working in the middle of nowhere, completely isolated. The name might sound like they were performing a little jig, but the only dancing they did was to avoid getting crushed or maimed. 17. No tour of dumb Wild West jobs would be complete without the legendary snake oil salesman. This wasn't just a job, it was a traveling theatrical performance of pure deception. A charismatic charlatan would roll into town in a flashy wagon, gather a crowd, and promise a miracle cure. All that could fix everything from baldness to a broken heart. The snake oil itself was usually just a mix of mineral oil, red pepper, and whatever other junk he could find. The real skill was in the sales pitch. He had to be a master storyteller, a fake scientist, and a brilliant actor all at once. The dumb part? You were building a career on lies, and if your customers figured out their miracle cure was just spicy grease before you could get out of town, the grand finale of your performance often involved being covered in tar and feathers. 18. Every saloon served whiskey, but the quality could range from drinkable to industrial solvent. To figure out which was which, you needed the unofficial whiskey taster. This wasn't a cool sommelier job. When a new, questionable barrel of hooch arrived, the saloon keeper would find some poor, thirsty soul and offer him a free drink to be the guinea pig. This person's job was to take a sip and not immediately go blind or fall over twitching. The whiskey could be anything from raw ethanol to stuff flavored with tobacco spit, gunpowder, or even strychnine for an extra kick. You got a free drink, sure, but you were also playing Russian roulette with your internal organs. If you survived, the whiskey was deemed safe for paying customers. Your reward? maybe another glass of the same poison. 19. In an era before refrigeration, ice was a luxury item, and getting it was one of the dumbest, most dangerous jobs imaginable: the ice harvester. In the dead of winter, these guys would go out onto frozen lakes and rivers with massive saws and horse-drawn plows to cut out huge blocks of ice. It was brutally cold, heavy work, and one wrong step could send you plunging through the ice into the freezing water below. Weighed down by heavy clothes and tools, your chances of getting out alive were almost zero. You were literally risking a horrific, freezing death to harvest frozen water so that some rich guy in the city could have a cool drink in July. It's an insane level of risk for a product that literally melts away. 20. The dynamite handler. The railroad and mining industries were built on the back of a new, terrifying invention: dynamite. And the poor soul hired to manage it was the dynamite handler. This wasn't the stable, safe explosive we know today. Early dynamite was incredibly volatile, made with nitroglycerin that would sweat out of the stick, making it hypersensitive. One wrong jiggle, one accidental drop, a sudden temperature change, or even a static spark could set it off. Your job was to transport, prepare, and place these sweating sticks of death while trying not to sneeze too hard. You were a walking, talking bomb with a terrible salary. The job required nerves of steel and a profound lack of imagination about all the ways you could be instantaneously transformed into a fine red mist. It's the only job where your best-case scenario was just surviving your shift. 21. The great buffalo herds were a symbol of the untamed West, but after they were hunted to near extinction, a new, grim industry emerged: the buffalo bone picker. This was a truly post-apocalyptic job. People would wander the vast, empty plains, which were littered with millions of skeletons, and collect the bones. These bones were then shipped back east by the trainload to be ground into fertilizer and carbon for sugar refining. Imagine spending your days in eerie silence, surrounded by the skeletal remains of a vanished world, gathering bones like some kind of grim reaper. It was a dirty, lonely, and deeply depressing job that served as a full-time reminder of the ecological devastation that had just taken place. You weren't a pioneer, you were a cleaner of the world's largest boneyard. 22. If collecting animal bones was too mainstream for you, you could always go into the human bone business as a resurrectionist. More commonly known as a grave robber, this was the person who supplied corpses to the few medical schools and doctors who needed them for anatomical study. Your job was to sneak into a cemetery at night, locate a fresh grave, and dig up the recently deceased, all without getting caught. It was physically demanding, morally questionable, and incredibly risky. Grieving families didn't take kindly to their loved ones being exhumed for science, and a shovel to the head or a blast of buckshot was a common occupational hazard. It was a high-risk, low-reward job that guaranteed you a special place in hell and zero friends at the local church picnic. 23. The dream of striking it rich led many men to the West, but some found it easier to just fake it. This was the job of the mine salter, a professional gold rush scammer. Here's how it worked. You'd take a worthless, empty mine and salt it with gold. This often involved loading a shotgun with gold dust and firing it into the walls of the cave to embed tiny flakes, or strategically placing a few valuable nuggets where a potential buyer was sure to discover them. You would then sell this worthless hole in the ground to some naive prospector for a fortune. The dumb part was the risk. This wasn't a simple con, it was an act that, if discovered, would almost certainly lead to you being hanged from the nearest tree without a trial. You were gambling your life for a quick payday. 24. Nothing strikes fear into the heart quite like the words, traveling dentist. This wasn't a trained professional in a clean office. This was a showman with a pair of rusty pliers and a high tolerance for screaming. He'd set up a chair in the middle of town, maybe hire a brass band to drown out the noise, and proceed to cure toothaches by yanking teeth out of people's heads. There was no anesthesia, no sanitation, just brute force. He would often put his knee on the patient's chest for leverage while he pulled. People would line up, driven by agonizing pain, to undergo a public torture session that was as much a spectator sport as it was a medical procedure. The dentist got paid, But he had to wrestle with every single patient and was probably the most feared man in any town he visited. 25. The words bounty hunter conjure images of Clint Eastwood coolly tracking down hardened criminals for a huge reward. The reality was usually far dumber. Meet the bounty hunter for petty crimes. Forget notorious outlaws. Your targets were more likely to be guys who stole a chicken or skipped out on a $5 debt. The rewards were laughably small, often just barely enough to cover the cost of your bullets and a decent meal. You would spend days tracking a man across rugged country, risking your life in a potential shootout, all to earn a reward that wouldn't even buy you a new hat. It was all the danger of the legendary profession, with none of the glory or the financial payoff. You weren't a bringer of justice, you were a repo man for farm animals. 26. Before psychology, there was phronology, the so-called science of bumps. And the person who practiced it was the phronologist, the original brain scammer with calipers. This expert would have you sit down while he carefully felt the lumps and divots on your skull. Based on his findings, he would confidently tell you your personality traits, your hidden talents, and whether you had a criminal disposition. It was complete and utter nonsense, but people paid good money for it. The job required you to look incredibly serious while spouting gibberish with a straight face. You were basically a fortune teller who had replaced the crystal ball with your customer's own head. The dumbest part? This wasn't seen as a silly party trick. It was considered cutting-edge science by many. 27. Finding water in the arid West was a matter of life and death. And when all else failed, settlers turned to the water dowser. This was a professional stick waver with zero credentials. The dowser would walk slowly across a piece of land, holding a forked stick or a pair of rods with intense concentration. When the stick mysteriously twitched or pointed downwards, that was the spot to dig your well. Was it a mystical connection to the Earth's energies? Or was it just a guy making an educated guess and putting on a good show? Science says the latter. You were paid for your intuition, but if you were wrong and a family spent weeks digging a dry hole based on your magic, you'd better hope you were long gone. Your entire career was based on a twitchy piece of wood and blind faith. 28. The vast, treeless prairies of the West offered little fuel for fires. So, what did the pioneers burn to cook their food and stay warm? The answer is the buffalo poop picker. Officially, the fuel was called buffalo chips, dried patties of buffalo dung. And someone's job was to walk across the plains and collect it. You would wander for miles, filling sacks with dried manure. It was a vital resource, burning surprisingly well with very little smoke. But let's not romanticize this. Your entire day was spent picking up poop. It was a job that literally stank. Children were often tasked with this, making it a family activity of dung gathering. It's a humbling reminder that on the frontier, survival sometimes meant getting your hands very, very dirty. 29. For lonely cowboys, miners, and soldiers in frontier towns, a bit of female company was a prized commodity. This led to the creation of the Nicola dance girl. Working in a dance hall, your job was to be a human jukebox. A man would pay 5 cents, and you would have to dance with him for the duration of one song. This meant waltzing, polka-ing, and being spun around by a succession of often drunk, clumsy, and smelly men for hours on end. The pay was terrible, the work was physically exhausting, and you constantly had to fend off unwanted advances that went beyond just dancing. You were selling a few minutes of polite, fleeting companionship in a world starved for it, one exhausting nickel at a time. 30. The camp cook. On a long cattle drive, the most important and most dangerous man wasn't the trail boss, it was the camp cook, or cookie. This guy was the absolute dictator of the chuck wagon, responsible for feeding a dozen or more exhausted, hungry, and heavily armed cowboys 3 times a day. His kitchen was a dusty wagon. His ingredients were basically beans, bacon, and biscuits, and his customers were the grumpiest people on earth. A good meal could keep morale high, but one bad batch of coffee or a burnt pot of beans could lead to a full-blown mutiny. He had to be a master of logistics, a passable chef, and a grizzled diplomat, all while driving a wagon over rough terrain. Messing with Cookie was a terrible idea, but his job was a high-pressure nightmare where one culinary mistake could get you fired. Or worse. 31. In the days of hand-set printing, the newspaper compositor was a vital part of every town's news operation. Their job was to stand in a poorly ventilated room and painstakingly arrange tiny individual letters made of lead into lines of text for the printing press. It was incredibly detailed, eye-straining work. But the real danger was the lead itself. These compositors were constantly handling the toxic metal, breathing in lead dust all day long. They were slowly poisoning themselves just to print the weekly news about land auctions and local gossip. Many suffered from tremors, confusion, and early death from lead poisoning. They were literally sacrificing their health and their lives for the sake of your morning lies and advertisements. 32. Every town had a hotel or a saloon that served hot meals, but they didn't have refrigerated trucks bringing in supplies. They had a restaurant hunter. This wasn't a sportsman hunting for trophies. This was a guy whose job was to go out every single day and kill something, anything, to supply the kitchen. Whether it was deer, rabbit, birds, or even a bear, if he came back empty-handed, the restaurant's menu would be empty, and he wouldn't get paid. It was the ultimate high-pressure food delivery job. You faced dangerous animals, extreme weather, and the constant stress of knowing that a whole dining room of hungry, impatient customers was depending on your aim. You were feeding the city folk, often with your own blood, sweat, and broken ribs. 33. Finally, religion on the frontier wasn't always a quiet affair in a church. It was often a loud, theatrical spectacle, brought to you by the itinerant preacher with a gimmick. This wasn't your calm, thoughtful pastor. This was a traveling spiritual showman who had to compete with saloons and gunfights for attention. He'd use fire and brimstone rants, claim to perform fake miracles, or develop some other wild gimmick to draw a crowd and, more importantly, get donations. He was part preacher, part entertainer, and part con artist, selling salvation like it was snake oil. His job was to travel from one dusty town to the next, putting on the greatest, and often loudest, show on earth, trying to save souls before the locals got bored and went back to the bar. 901, so there you have it. 33 jobs that prove the Wild West was far more bizarre and brutal than the movies ever let on. These were the people who did the dirty, dangerous, and dumbest work to build a new world. It makes you appreciate your desk job a little more, doesn't it? Now for the real question. If you were transported back to the Wild West and had to choose one of these jobs to survive, which one would it be and why? Let us know your terrible life choice in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this glimpse into historical absurdity, be sure to shoot that like button and subscribe for more.